Welcome to Single Malt History with Gareth Russell, pouring out your serving of pure, distilled, intoxicating, and occasionally delicious history. Hello and welcome to the first and, God willing, not the last episode of Single Malt History with Gareth Russell. Upon that introduction, it might be fairly obvious that I am the eponymous Gareth Russell as opposed to the eponymous Single Malt. I'm the author of 5 works of non-fiction history, most recently The Ship of Dreams, The Sinking of the Titanic and the End of the Edwardian Era, and before that, Young and Damned and Fair, a biography of Henry VIII's tragic fifth wife, Queen Catherine Howard. I say tragic fifth wife, but I suppose really they were all pretty much tragic simply by being married to him. History is a fantastic drink shelf of stories, to belabour the metaphor, and every week I will endeavour to titillate, inform, distract and amuse with a particular tale from the past. There is a lot of misinformation out there, so I promise to keep it accurate but also entertaining. In homage to the elephant graveyard of to-read books currently occupying my study, I'll also try to give good recommendations or warnings from any books I'm currently reading, which hopefully means I will get through them and stop buying new books before I finish the old. Every other episode, it won't just be me and my lonesome, but a wildly unprofessional interview with a fellow historian, as well as the occasional glitzy chat with the beautiful people of movie and television about historical characters they've played on screen or what history they enjoy. We have one of those coming up for the week after next, which I am so excited to share with you. It's the first time this actor has ever done a podcast interview, which I'm very flattered about. And let's just say, if you've enjoyed how Tudor queens have been portrayed in modern television series, I think you're really going to enjoy this interview. And with that, it's incumbent upon me to say for the first time in my life, don't forget to subscribe, and please leave a review if you like it. If you don't, only Jesus needs to hear that. This week, I'll be telling you about Basiliscus, the emperor who died in the bathroom. While we may be more familiar with the basilisk via the bathroom at Hogwarts, Emperor Basiliscus's death in the loo is really the greatest example in history of why you should always read the fine print on any deal you make. You may have heard the word Byzantine or the phrase Byzantine, different pronunciations, let's say Byzantine Empire before, but it's not hugely taught in Western history. It's often half forgotten if it's remembered at all. What's about to follow is a reductive but hopefully digestible assessment of it, which is that the Byzantine Empire was the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and it lasted for about 11 centuries longer than the western half. It didn't completely collapse until 1453. In the 4th century AD, 2 massive changes happened in the Roman Empire that set up what Byzantium would become. The first was that Emperor Constantine the Great decided that the Roman Empire no longer needed to be ruled from Rome, so he moved the capital city hundreds of miles to the east to the port of Byzantium, which was renamed Constantinople, the city of Constantine, who transformed it into one of the largest and most splendid cities in history, and probably felt he'd earned the right to name it after himself. Today, Constantinople is known by its Turkish name of Istanbul. It's worth noting at this point in history that the land that we now call Turkey was at this point predominantly populated by Greeks, which explains why Greek eventually came to replace Latin as the official language of the empire. The second big change that Constantine implements is that Christianity was adopted as the empire's official religion, a pretty remarkable turnaround for the faith, given the levels of persecution it had endured under earlier pagan Roman emperors. The Roman Empire by this point was buckling under a combined pressure of its own size and resentment from European communities outside its borders. In many ways, the adoption of Christianity ironically helped hold the empire together with a new collective identity for a lot longer than expected, but either way, its days were numbered. It was simply too big to rule effectively anymore, considering how long it had been there, and also just the vagaries and difficulties of getting messages from one part of the empire to another. And its glory days were thus firmly behind it, at least in the west of Europe. The eastern half of the empire continued to flourish, and it would take a long time before the East accepted that the West really was lost to them and was splitting into separate kingdoms and communities. It's also, of course, worth noting that the northern parts of Africa were part of the Roman Empire. Basically, Morocco and Tunisia were classed as part of the West, and the rest were classed as part of the East. But why the West collapsed, etc., really is taking us too far from this story, for the purposes of which we need to know that Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, or as it was called more commonly then, the Empire in the East, was a predominantly Greek-speaking, very wealthy, predominantly and passionately Christian empire that ruled from the city of Constantinople over the areas which are today Greece, Turkey, Albania, Montenegro, Kosovo, Macedonia, Bulgaria, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Palestine, and Lebanon, as well as parts of Romania, Serbia, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Herzegovina, and Libya. Obviously, these borders were in a state of flux throughout Byzantium's long history, but hopefully this gives us a general idea of the empire we're talking about when a general called Basiliscus unexpectedly became its emperor in the year 475. Basiliscus was a man who had been close to power all his life. Born into a prominent family in the provinces in southeastern Europe, we don't know exactly where, he seems to have had some pretty thorough military training. Basiliscus rose to the heart of influence, however, when his sister Verina married Emperor Leo the Great. The emperor saw his new brother-in-law's military background as useful to the empire, and so Basiliscus was swiftly promoted to become one of the commanders-in-chief of the imperial armies. Now, given what happened later, I think it's not controversial to say that Basiliscus's name isn't exactly associated with success, but in the interest of fairness, it's not true that he was incompetent from the get-go and that he was only entrusted with these military appointments because his sister had married the emperor. He was very successful in helping to secure Byzantium's borders in Eastern Europe, but in 468, Emperor Leo put brother-in-law Basiliscus in charge of one of the largest military operations in late antiquity. You may remember me mentioning that the western half of the old Roman Empire was falling apart, but that it took the empire in the east a really long time to accept that the empire in the west had fallen. Well, in 468, Emperor Leo authorized a massive naval assault to retake some of the former western provinces in northwest Africa. A particular goal for Leo was to subjugate the fabulously wealthy city of Carthage. Carthage no longer really exists, but its ruins are located, I believe, in Tunisia. And after Roman decline, it had become the capital city of the Vandal kingdoms. So attacking Carthage was to partly punish the king of the Vandals for sacking Rome 13 years earlier. And yes, we get the word Vandal and vandalism from the Vandals, who were seen as spoiling a city through their actions. At a conservative estimate, Emperor Leo dedicated just over 1 full year's worth of his empire's income to fund the war effort that he placed under General Basiliscus's command. So that gives you an idea of just how enormous this military expedition was and just how cataclysmic it was for Byzantium when half the fleet was incinerated off the coast of Tunisia and the other half followed Basiliscus when he fled from possible defeat, allegedly halfway through the battle. So Basiliscus, I knew that name was going to trip me up. The Byzantium names are a delicious maze of horror. So, Basiliscus does not exactly return to a hero's welcome in Constantinople. In fact, when he landed, he suddenly realized how angry people were with him, and he had to flee to the great church of Hagia Sophia to beg for sanctuary from the church, which was apparently the only thing that stopped him from being torn limb from limb by an angry mob. Basiliscus was saved from execution by the entreaties of his sister Empress Verina, who begged her understandably furious husband, Emperor Leo, to show mercy to his brother-in-law. Verina's begging worked, and Leo commuted the sentence from one of execution to exile, sending Basiliscus to live in southern Bulgaria with his wife Zenonis and their son Marcus. It seemed at this point as if Basiliscus was ruined, but Byzantine politics deserves its reputation for spinning fortune's wheel like the roulette at a Vegas casino, and a few years later, Basiliscus was invited back to court to help support Emperor Leo and Empress Verina against various political enemies. So the disaster in Tunisia is forgiven, but it's not forgotten. The appalling humanitarian, military, and economic losses from the Carthaginian campaign will haunt Basiliscus's reputation, both with the elite and the common people, for the rest of his life. Politically, when you make that kind of mistake, you can't ever afford to set a foot wrong again, because the ghost of your past failure is always one step behind you. Basiliscus is nonetheless back at the heart of influence at a very interesting time. His sister Verina had never had a son, and so to prepare for a peaceful succession to the throne, her daughter, Ariadne, was married to another high-ranking general, Zeno. They do have a son, who they christen Leo after his grandfather, and who becomes child emperor when Leo the Great dies in January 474. Tragically, little Leo II succumbs to one of the many infant infections at the time and dies after only 9 months as emperor, by which point his grieving but brilliant mother Ariadne has pulled off a blinder of a political coup to keep power in the family, making sure her husband, General Zeno, is proclaimed as the new emperor in the East. So in theory, Zeno's proclamation as emperor leaves Basiliscus in another potentially lucrative set of circumstances. In 5th century Constantinople, it's not so much 6 degrees of separation in the elite, but about 2, and you'll come to Basiliscus. He's not just brother to the previous empress, but uncle to the new one. However, Basiliscus was notorious for his ambition. Apparently, it was a long-running political joke in Constantinople about how desperate he was to become emperor himself, and he lost no time undermining his niece and her husband. And he did this partly by playing on what we might call xenophobic tendencies in Constantinople. And considering that the guy Basiliscus was going after was called Zeno, xenophobic is an unfortunate, if accurate, double entendre of prejudice. Zeno was an Isaurian, a people who lived in and around the Taurus Mountains and near what's now the Konya province in central Turkey. They were regarded by many people in Constantinople as barbarians, glorified thugs, who were certainly clearly inferior in terms of dignity to those who lived in the empire's privileged heartlands. Seeing an Isaurian like Zeno become emperor riled a lot of people in Constantinople. Some of these people had been unhappy even at the marriage of Princess Ariadne years ago to General Zeno, because they felt it demeaned the quote-unquote sacred dignity of the imperial bloodline. But opposition to the new emperor really began to escalate when a lot of Zeno's fellow Isaurians started emigrating to Constantinople, encouraged by the fact that a fellow Isaurian was now head of the empire. Basiliscus played on these tensions in the capital shamelessly, and in this he was helped by his wife Xenonis, who persuaded many important people to join her husband's plot to become emperor. Emperor Zeno, one afternoon, went to the Hippodrome, which was a massive sports amphitheatre in the heart of Constantinople, and while he was there, the emperor was interrupted by a messenger who approached him while he was watching one of the chariot races. The messenger had come from Zeno's mother-in-law, the Dowager Empress Verina, who warned him that Basiliscus had united the army, the Senate, and the people in a plot against him. If he valued his life, Zeno was advised to flee, and so that night, Zeno and his wife Ariadne escaped from Constantinople under the cover of darkness, making a mad dash to safety in the mountains of Isauria. Behind them, blood ran thick through the streets of Constantinople as Basiliscus's supporters celebrated his seizure of the throne by slaughtering the Isaurians who had recently moved to the city. Basiliscus's time as emperor thus began in blood, and people began to whisper that the new emperor was cursed. As I said earlier, considering the defeat in Carthage when he was a general, Basiliscus lived with the spectre of his own incompetence. People saw that hovering behind him, and yet as emperor he continued to make mistakes that would lead him to the dreaded bathroom. He increased taxation, which never goes down well. He also turned his sister, the Dowager Empress Verina, into a mortal enemy by ordering the murder of the lover she had taken in widowhood, which seems poor thanks, to put it mildly, for all the help Verina had given him in years gone by, especially considering that it was she who had saved his life in the aftermath of his Tunisian defeat. Basiliscus did have some sense of familial loyalty, though, and he promoted his spectacularly handsome nephew Horatius to the same glorified military position that he had held under Emperor Leo. No one could deny Horatius looked the part, and that he knew he looked the part. Personally, nothing screams modesty quite like turning up to the Hippodrome dressed as Achilles, which Horatius apparently did in a particularly masturbatory form of fancy dress. The brains, unfortunately, did not match the face, and the morals matched neither, because Horatius repaid Uncle Basiliscus's generosity by seducing his wife, Empress Xenonis. A chronicler tells us that as Horatius and Xenonis were both persons of no ordinary beauty, they became extravagantly enamoured of each other. They used to exchange glances of the eyes, they constantly turned their faces to smile at each other, and the passion which they were obliged to conceal was the cause of suffering to them. So they confided their trouble to Daniel, a eunuch, and to Maria, a midwife, who hardly healed their malady by bringing them together. Horatius was not exactly shy, as we've established, or easy to miss, whether dressed as Achilles or otherwise, and thus rumours of the empress's affair with her husband's handsome nephew shot through the city, further decreasing public respect for Basiliscus. But what really did for Basiliscus was religion. It is hard to fully impress upon people the extent to which Christianity and its philosophies inspired deep passion in Byzantium. I've mentioned the Hippodrome. The two main charioteering teams, who were rock star athletes to the population, were called the Greens and the Blues. Not imaginative, but informative. They picked rival interpretations of the nature of Christ and the importance of the Virgin Mary, as well as different sports teams. And they spilled out into the streets of Constantinople on more than one occasion, beating each other to a pulp while screaming really quite niche theological concepts and insults to their opponents mid-bludgeon. So full disclosure, I love theological history, and I can usually pinpoint fairly esoteric details of what people believe and why. Why Mariology was the foundational philosophy to defining Christology. Write me a song about it and I will sing it. Eucharistic theology, sign me up. Why Donatism is a disaster. Pour me a glass. The sacrament's here for it. Eschatology, delighted. But I have struggled for about 2 days of solid research on this one concept in trying to explain for you what basiliscus did or believed that ticked off so many people. So part of the problem, I think, is that it might just be that I'm stupid, but this dispute that he was involved in largely centers, I think, on different ways to translate Greek. So as a heads up, when you see modern translations of the Bible, for instance, and they use the word love, the chances are that any original in Greek will be a lot more specific about what type of love it is, but it's usually just given in English translations as love. So I'm assuming that is why this dispute sounds to us, certainly to me, more like a semantic difference rather than something to go to war over. I would really like to thank The Real Med White for his online lecture, The Monophysite Crisis and the Theology of Severus of Antioch. And in particular, I'd like to thank Father Gabriel Vissa of the Coptic Orthodox Church for his explanation on YouTube about what Miaphysite theology is. They helped me more than I can say. So, at this point, Christianity is still very divided over what the nature of Christ is. Was he always God in human form? Was the theophany, when he announces his divinity in the New Testament, simply when he announced it, or was it when it happened? How do God and man coexist within one? So the Great Church Council of Chalcedon divined the answer as one of the great mysteries in which Jesus was always Christ and Christ was always God, and that within his one earthly body there coexisted two separate but united and undiluted natures, that he was both fully God and fully man simultaneously. This is the two natures of Christ, which is still the position taken by most branches of Christianity today, particularly European and American originating or based Christian denominations. However, the Council of Chalcedon was still facing some fairly significant opposition from other Christians who were either Monophysite or Miaphysite. Basiliscus was a Miaphysite who believed that Christ had one nature that was both divine and human intermingled with each other, rather than divine and human contained within one body. So I'm being really reductive here on some of the most complex and subtle philosophy ever articulated, but I think I'm right in saying that Chalcedonian Christianity teaches of a Christ of one body with two natures, while Miaphysite Christianity that Basiliscus adhered to teaches of a Christ of one body with one intermingled nature. As I said, Chalcedonian Christianity is by far and away the most popular interpretation of Christology today, but it's doing so well. But Miaphysitism is adhered to in the Coptic, Syriac, Malankara, Ethiopian Tawahedo, Eritrean Tawahedo Orthodox churches, and also in the Armenian Apostolic Church. Chalcedonian Christianity was particularly popular and revered in Constantinople, and so Basiliscus's decision to start promoting Miaphysite preachers and his cancellation of several policies enacted by the Council of Chalcedon radicalized and united opposition against him. Daniel, a famous hermit for the past 15 years, came out of isolation to preach publicly against the new emperor's alleged blasphemy, while Acacius, the patriarch or a kind of pope of Constantinople, really lent in with a flair for the dramatic by ordering every priest in the city to start wearing mourning funeral attire and to drape the high altar in Hagia Sophia in black, because clearly the emperor plotted the death of the church. Just as his Miaphysite proclamations were being sent out, heaven itself told the people of Constantinople that Basiliscus was sinning. A fire broke out and swept through the city, incinerating the bazaar, immolating the great library with all 120,000 copies of its books, including ancient copies of the Trojan War saga written in letters of gold. And the flames spread into the aristocratic district, where they consumed the legendarily splendid palace of Lausus, destroying its priceless collection of ancient sculptures. It seems to have started this great fire with a bronze smith, but it's unclear. Obviously, there were other accounts of, it sort of spontaneously combusting. It was one of the worst fires, however, in Constantinople's history. Convinced that the empire and the emperor were cursed, some of his generals fled the burning city to bend the knee to the fugitive Zeno. Reinvigorated, Zeno and Ariadne now had an army that they marched out of the mountains of Isauria, moving towards a traumatized Constantinople, which they rightly suspected would now be only too happy to be ruled by an Isaurian rather than by Basiliscus. The emperor, however, was not quite ready to surrender, and he sent his commander and nephew Hormatius at the head of an army to crush Zeno's forces before he reached the capital city. Having repeatedly betrayed his uncle personally by committing adultery with his wife, Hormatius now betrayed him politically. He transferred his allegiance to Zeno, and in doing so, Hormatius handed Basiliscus's army over to his enemy. Realizing that the jig was up, for the second time in his life, Basiliscus fled through the streets of Constantinople and threw himself on the mercy of the church by begging for sanctuary at Hagia Sophia. Though they had loathed Basiliscus's policies, the patriarch and the church would not violate the laws of sanctuary even for an enemy. And so they swung open Hagia Sophia's doors for Basiliscus, who was joined by his wife Xenonus and their son Marcus. There, beneath the mosaics and images of Christ and Mary, the deposed imperial family waited for Zeno to arrive. Zeno and Ariadne returned through the great gates at Constantinople at the height of summer in 477, only 18 months after they had fled for their lives because of Basiliscus's coup. To peacefully return the order of power, however, they needed Basiliscus to surrender. The couple knew that they couldn't trust Ariadne's ambitious, treacherous uncle after everything he had done. And they needed him to leave Hagia Sophia so that there wouldn't be any more potential alternative emperors lurking and waiting to capitalize on Zeno's future mistakes. So, messengers bounced back and forward between the palace and the cathedral. Eventually, Basiliscus agreed to surrender if Zeno promised Basiliscus that he wouldn't shed his blood or that of his immediate family. Zeno made that promise, upon which Basiliscus, his wife, and their son handed themselves over into imperial custody. But this is why you should read the small print. For Zeno had only promised not to spill Basiliscus's blood. He had no intention of forgiving the man who had stolen his throne and slaughtered his people. Basiliscus, his wife Xenonus, and their son Marcus were arrested and deported on the emperor's command hundreds of miles to the east to a military fortress in Cappadocia, what is today northeastern Turkey. There, the ex-emperor, the ex-empress, and their son Marcus were thrown, on Zeno's orders, into a disused cistern. There they were left, exposed and hungry, when the Cappadocian winter with its snow, blizzards and gales settled in. Malnutrition and ice killed all three of them, thus meaning that Emperor Zeno had technically kept the promise of Hagia Sophia. He had not spilled their blood. Basiliscus's death is notorious as an example of hair-splitting to keep the letter but not the spirit of a promise. And the story, as they always do, grew in the telling, to say that he had been thrown down a toilet and killed there. But that is the story of Basiliscus of the bathroom, the Caesar in the cistern. I hope you enjoyed it. And next week will be a bit special because it's the anniversary of the Titanic's voyage and sinking. So every day for the week, there'll be an episode up taking you through the tragedy from day to day. And I'm very excited that we have extremely talented actors who have recorded some of the eyewitness testimonies from the Titanic's passengers and crew. So I'll narrate a little bit about what happened each day of the voyage and the sinking, and then you'll hear some of these brilliant actors reading out accounts from people who were there at the time. So make sure you subscribe and tune in for our Titanic Week specials. And in the meantime, I wish you a great few days with luck much better than Basiliscus's.